Let's go back in time. Not incredibly far back, just 1 year, to last year's Oscars. Then, in 2025, the contenders for Best Picture included a sci-fi epic sequel, an experimentally filmed period drama looking into brutal truths of racism in Jim Crow America, a gory feminist body horror film with European festival accolades, and a gritty, Palme d'Or winning, super R-rated anti-Cinderella story about a young sex worker in New York City made for a budget of just $4 million. To me, these films seemed to add new flavors to a lineup that also included more traditional-seeming Best Picture preferences. A lavish musical, a period biopic, a sweeping drama shot in VistaVision, and a movie set in Europe starring Ralph Fiennes. I started to wonder if this motley assemblage of films promised to usher in new definitions about what makes a Best Picture nominee. This week, I talk with celebrated filmmaker, teacher, and writer Alex Rollins Berg about theater-going, cable subscriptions of old, streaming services, and other factors that perhaps have fostered a change in our definitions of cinematic prestige. I'm your host, Olivia Rutigliano, and this is Culture Schlock. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here, Olivia. I love talking to you always in social life and on podcasts and such.
I want to start by introducing Alex. Alex Rollins Berg is an award-winning filmmaker and screenwriter based in New York City. His writing and directing have earned recognition from The Blacklist, Harvard University's Hasty Pudding Fellowship, New Renaissance London, and more. In addition to directing and occasionally teaching film at NYU's Stone Street Studios, Alex is the creator of Underexposed, a weekly Substack podcast extravaganza spotlighting exceptional but overlooked films. And so we're very excited to have you on Culture Schlock today, given that that's the framework in which you've been operating for the past few months. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about Underexposed?
I want to mention that Olivia was the inaugural guest on Underexposed and really an early cheerleader for that project. And so I am over the moon to be here.
Thrilled to have you. Thank you so much, Alex. So today we're talking about the concept of prestige as it applies to the movie industry now. And just before we begin, I have a guest who will be joining us for a few moments, who emblematizes the marrying between culture and schlock. This beautiful chocolate Oscar, which was given to me on Valentine's Day and which has survived past the Academy Awards and will now be devoured. Prior to the Oscars, there was this interesting viral thing that went around saying that certain Academy members did not vote for Ralph Fiennes and instead chose to vote for Adrien Brody for Best Actor because they thought that Ralph Fiennes already had an Oscar and that Adrien Brody did not. And certainly the inverse is true. Ralph Fiennes has not been decorated. And this got us thinking about questions and associations of cinematic prestige, especially in a moment like with this Oscar race, where films not normally considered traditional sort of Oscar bait, like The Substance or even Anora, were up for some of the very big prizes, whereas films like The Outrun, Saoirse Ronan's like human interest, Bildungsroman, like coming of age, sobriety story, like barely even squeaked into theaters, let alone got Oscar campaigns, it seems. So these were sort of the jumping off points that we were thinking about. And so I'm interested in continuing our discussion, Alex, about these sort of crises in the entertainment world right now in the definition and ideas of prestige.
Absolutely. I think this is such an interesting subject to delve into. I never thought about it much. Maybe people know this, but I didn't remember that the word prestige originally in the 17th century in France, when it sort of originated, referred not to widespread respect, but to trickery and illusions and associations with fraudulence. And I think that that's kind of an interesting thing to consider when considering prestige and its many forms and the way that it's shifted forms over the last few years. Um, I think we're all pretty comfortable with the idea, familiar with the idea that the internet has democratized, the cultural landscape. Um, Nowadays, film critics and tastemakers have less cultural influence, and even movies themselves have less cultural influence. And these large institutions like the Academy and legacy film festivals are increasingly under attack by these groups online for both reasons that are legitimate and not so legitimate. But in thinking about this, especially as a filmmaker, um, what was maybe more interesting to me when thinking about prestige and perhaps less widely understood is how streaming, the economics and the culture of streaming, have affected our appetites for what we formerly thought of as prestigious, adult-oriented, mid-budget movies, which were the bread and butter of the Oscars for many, many years.
Hmm.
Um, and just to speak on that, just it's a question of distribution at this point. I did some research, and it goes back to the early days of streaming when originally studios would work out these deals with global streaming platforms that were called pay one deals. They still exist, in which a studio works with a global streaming platform, and after theatrical and after home video release windows, they have an agreement where they release their entire slate onto streaming with that certain platform. Everything they release, large and small. But recently, those deals have become fewer and further between. And so every film needs to be negotiated independently, which has created a huge problem for these movies in this prestige space, which require oftentimes a mid-sized budget, which is to say a large budget by today's standards for costumes and period dramas and this kind of thing, but then also can't reliably recoup a large budget theatrically and don't have a home video revenue stream like Blu-ray or DVD to rely on, and can't also rely on getting award nominations like the Outrun, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
So I think that those are factors that are really contributing to like the dwindling supply of movies we think of as prestigious.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and that's so fascinating. I mean, I think it's interesting that the sort of metrics by which we historically judged cinematic prestige are sort of being switched out, but in ways that don't feel like equal public knowledge. Like we just sort of feel this cultural shift, and we watch different films become absorbed into these like once prestigious or these institutionally prestigious forums. And yet we sort of don't know all of the material or the information behind the curtain that indicates why all of this stuff is happening. I mean, streaming is one of the greatest, like, I don't want to say cons, but it's one of the greatest riddles in the modern entertainment marketplace. Just the way that even the residual structure is being replaced for actors and writers by virtue of streaming's like very nature as opposed to syndication, like through cable. It's so alarming, and all of this stuff is sort of happening under our noses. And in a way, it sort of harkens back to the original definition of prestige, which you mentioned, which is this sort of con or this illusion. I mean, like there's a reason why Christopher Nolan chose that as the pun of his title about sort of dueling magicians, right? I mean, it's and earlier on this episode, we had Samantha Hunt talking about Tesla. So I really like that it's all coming back to the prestige and
Full circle. I
Bowie.
love it.
Yeah, David Bowie coming out as Tesla. Um, but like it's true that there's a sort of bait and switch in today's modern culture, and it's purely commercial. And yet it's redefining artistic and aesthetic parameters for entire audiences.
Yeah, in ways good and bad, I must
Yeah.
add, because previously I don't think we would have seen a movie like The Substance or even like a Nora in the conversation. And that's exciting. To
Yeah.
me, that's very exciting. However, as someone who loves movies and loves, I love those old time Oscar movies, I love those. I miss those. And we need
Yeah.
those. Those are really great. And I found this interesting kind of case study that illuminates, I think, just how much things have changed in a very brief period of time. I looked back, and the height of Oscar popularity in terms of viewership was 1998. That was the year of Titanic, the year that
Yeah.
Titanic mopped the deck with everybody. Just a few years before that, in 1996, you mentioned Ray Fiennes before, we had the cultural phenomenon of The English Patient, Anthony Minghella movie, which starred Ray Fiennes and Juliette Binoche. It won Best Picture. It won Best Director. Binoche won for Best Supporting Actress, and Fiennes was nominated for that, which maybe is why people are confused. But that was a huge commercial and cultural phenomenon. Flash forward to 2024, and those two actors reunite in a very traditionally prestigious movie directed by Uberto Pasolini called The Return. This is a movie that retells the Odyssey. It came out in theaters and made, I'm not kidding you, under $1 million domestically, made less than a blip culturally and even critically. I was determined to see this movie. Somehow I found out about its existence. I had to go to Times Square at like 12:30 on a Tuesday, like to see this movie with like a sparsely
Mhm.
attended crowd up in like the upper floors of that theater. And then it was gone. It was gone
Mhm.
within a week. And just like, how crazy is that? That's just like how different the culture has become.
Mhm.
It's wild.
It's completely true. I mean, in the late 90s, right, in the era of like as you say, The English Patient and Shakespeare in Love and these like sweeping and Titanic, these sweeping historical costume dramas and epic romances, and also like movies about the ancient world. I mean, look at Gladiator's success. This movie would have done unbelievable numbers. I mean, the tagline is um is a bit is sort of satisfyingly ironic. Wait, let me find what it is. Um, wait, it's this is where is it? I just lost. I just had it. Oh my God, wait, no. Let me get this. Well, okay, I don't know. There was one satisfyingly ironic tagline I saw that was like, after 20 years, he's finally coming home. And it's like, no, he's not. Nobody even was waiting for him. Nobody knew that he was arriving. Like the Odysseus, the world you left 20 years ago, in which, your period drama might very well, if it considered for an Oscar post Lord of the Rings, is a very different world than the one you're returning to now. Um, Schlock. That's the schlock part of culture schlock. The jokes. We have the jokes. Um, but it's true. And one of the things we were talking about when we were doing our preliminary conversation, Alex, is the fate of the costume drama, the historical costume drama. How it's simply not worth it for studios to be making films of this lavish historical accuracy in terms of sets and costumes, because the amount of money that they'll be able to make on them is nil.
That's right. Unless I mean, they've kind of migrated, right? I mean, they've gone over to Shondaland or whatever, and there
Right.
are certain conditions under which you can tell not necessarily historical stories, but historically flavored stories,
Right.
maybe. I don't
Right.
know. Um, Another factor that I want to ask you about, Olivia, is the factor of economics. I mean, it used to be, I think, that there was a class of people that could go out and go to the opera and indulge in some of these traditionally prestigious pastimes, movies being only one of them. The number of those people are dwindling, and all of those institutions are under tremendous economic stress, movies included. How much of a factor do you think that is in the decline of traditional prestige?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. One of the things that I've been thinking about when it comes to prestige and movie-going culture is how, um, two things. One thing is how divided we are in terms of our access to entertainment. So historically, you would find out that a movie was playing. You'd see it in advertisements for another film, sure, but you'd also see it in posters and in the newspaper that you got. And now most of us get our news from increasingly individualized portals that exist mostly online that don't expose us to political, economic, artistic, and entertainment and other areas in which we may not have our hobby or niche. And so we're not being exposed to the breadth of what's out there. That's the first thing, this sort of increasing personalization, the sort of daily me of how we get our information, and then how that affects the content we gravitate to and we know exists. Second of all, and this is what we were talking about earlier, the sort of increasing of streaming and at-home entertainment. Um, you know, one of the things that I have, studied as a historian of like mass culture, and, I study mass culture the moment it's sort of becomes modern in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. We're talking how post-industrial revolution, everyone from the very, very low class to the very high class has access to the same information, partially because of growing literacy rates, but also increasing disposable incomes and leisure time, and a middle class that exists where there had not really been one before. And how the same people would be reading the same magazines. Like the Dickens stories would be read by the higher echelons and the lower because they would all be purchasable for a very affordable price in an easily accessible and producible format. um, you know, Movie theaters were about to exist. We had all of these sort of this, Tom Gunning's cinema of attractions technologies, right? We had fairs and exhibitions and places where people could go and experience technology together. And as a result, virtually the entire social world of a particular city could experience the same entertainment at the same time in a way that sets the stage for what happens in the 20th century. And I'm not saying that like in Shakespeare's day, like there weren't groundlings and then like more wealthy people in the same stands watching the same Shakespeare play. There were that this was absolutely the case. But this is the first time that there's a cultural engine that's introducing concepts like celebrity and a shared mass culture, and then like within that a sort of culture of fascination of fame and the sort of rags to riches rise of various celebrities. All of this starts happening at the same time in a way that makes culture very accessible. So in the 20th century, we still have this. We have an enormous, thriving studio system with lots of different movie making companies, tons and tons and tons of stars, and tons and tons and tons of movies that are often played back to back in showings. And we do not have a home video market, obviously, until, much, much, much later in the century. And yet, people still have access to so many films. And what has changed? Why, when a certain film would only have a run in a theater for like 3 weeks, would it seem like everyone saw that movie versus now, where you can rent something almost immediately on your TV and sort of no one's seen it? I don't think like that a saturation point is the actual problem because there was so much content being produced back then too, but it's how that content was deliverable to us. Um, this is a different social world when you went out to experience culture. You left your home to experience culture, unless you were reading, unless you're Burgess Meredith in the Twilight Zone episode, right? Like you are going out, and movies and theater, and even to some extent for certain classes, opera, those are sort of all in the same echelon. You leave your home and you go experience entertainment. The thing that changes is not only the sort of advent of cable, which makes more and more movies available. Excuse me, my dog is growling. Hi, can you be quiet for a second? So we have cable in, the 80s and 90s, which certainly allows, I guess not 80s, then there's cable in the 90s, which really allows the idea of um, which really allows the idea that you can access a movie that hasn't yet officially been released. It sort of sets that up for the streaming market that we are in now. And now we just have different channels that we can choose to subscribe to that have projects on them that we've never heard about before because they're just sort of being dropped into these portals. And it's on us, unless something is being very heavily marketed, it's on us to figure out where those things are, as opposed to going to open the paper or going by the movie theater and seeing what's playing. I also think that in our increasingly insular online culture, people are less and less interested in being exposed to things that they don't know or don't like. Um, and this is adaptable to like 4chan alt-right groups and also like film Twitter. Um, it used to be when you went to the movies, you went to the movies and that was the event. And you kind of saw whatever was playing. And here, you don't turn on whatever's on. And I suppose that's the big shift between cable and streaming. That in cable you could flip channels and just settle on something. Here it's more of a deliberate decision to choose to either purchase or stream or subscribe to the service. There are all these levels of decision and acceptance and choice that I think get in the way of the access between the art form and the consumer. That was a long answer. I'll edit that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's also an issue of control, right? I mean, when
Yes.
you step into a movie theater, the screen is huge. The faces on it are larger than life, and you surrender to an experience at a certain
Yes.
time in a semi-public space.
Right.
On television, from the age of television
Yep.
onwards, you have a remote control. You
Yep.
have a situation where the incentives shift around who is in control and who's paying for the
Yep.
experience. In a movie theater, the product is the movie.
Right.
In a television framework, even from the early days, and of course we know this about the internet, the user or viewer is the product,
Right.
and the productions are being paid for by the sponsors. And so the incentives are different. The level of control that the viewer has over the experience is different. And yeah, I think the investment is different. And what I think I want to ask you about, what's really interesting is like we can complain quite easily about the shortcomings and problems of traditional prestige as we knew it for so many decades. But in a world without it, it's quite disorienting and chaotic for all the reasons you laid out, but also for an interesting reason that I've kind of stumbled on in conversations about this, which is a lack of hierarchy, which
Mhm.
on its face sounds like a great thing. We want to democratize everything, but what I think it does in the life of an artist, in the life of a filmmaker, and even a film lover, it's like, well, what do I watch if everything's equal? And who do I seek to become if I want to be an artist? If nobody's really being awarded, if there's no real sense of excellence and everything's kind of equal, where do I aim and what's the point?
Yeah, this is such an excellent question, and I think it dovetails very perfectly with what's happening in the world of journalism and specifically arts journalism, which is even relatable to our current political moment, which is about not trusting journalists and not trusting sort of mainstream um, sources. We have, a conspiratorial president and his conspiratorial underlings who are constantly saying that we are the source and that you can't trust what the media is saying. And whether or not this directly relates to consumers of art and reviewers they solicit for opinions sort of is immaterial because we have this overwhelming culture of suspicion and um, the idea that someone who is reviewing something is simply projecting someone who's reviewing something is simply projecting an opinion, as opposed to the reviewer or the critic as a scholar of an art form who is able to explain what works and what doesn't work in a particular thing and make an artwork accessible as possible to viewers. And I think, one of the things we were talking about is what has sort of happened on the internet as of late, but sort of the difference between prestige and sort of clout. That like in today's world, being able to tear something down or being able to reject a sort of authority of opinion is seen as somehow superior, seen as somehow a superior way to be and way to form opinions, rather than a sort of knowledge gathering, cherry picking, well-rounded, well-read approach. And I think all of these things are braided together um, in the creation of an extremely isolated entertainment experience.
Completely. And I think it's also just a crude byproduct of the fact that technology is making so many of our decisions for us, and the
Yeah.
fact that these algorithms they're not we're not assessing quality like we used to. We're thinking of it in cruder terms, like you say, these metrics that we now have access to, that communicate cloud.
Hmm.
It's not about quality, it's about how many views, how many likes, how much engagement, and
Right.
that subconsciously and consciously determines the value of something in the
Mhm.
eyes of many people that just a few short years ago would have looked to, I don't know, Roger Ebert or somebody like that for like an indication of what to go see. Now it's like there's a large faction of people that sort of think, well, and the Oscars is such a perfect place for for this kind of conversation to boil over. Why aren't the most popular financially successful movies just winning the best picture? A lot of people think that way now.
Yes, exactly. That was perfectly said. And I think the Oscars has always been uniquely at the center of that debate because, I mean, for most of movie history, there's been this constant pushback between a sort of like intellectual approach to the craft and sort of a mass market approach to the craft. I mean, every industry has this. And it doesn't mean that there isn't excellence on both sides or scholarship on both sides. But, when The Greatest Show on Earth won Best Picture, in the first ever like audio broadcast Oscars, it beat High Noon, Ivanhoe, the original Moulin Rouge, and The Quiet Man. And the film with the most spectacle won. And it's, considered this like now it's considered retroactively this like masterpiece of scale, but it wasn't considered like this powerful cinematic experiment back then. And it was a sort of this weird representation of the Oscars going full commercial. And it's like, what do you mean? The Oscars have always been commercial. It's a commercial institution. Similarly, like, in 1998, when Shakespeare in Love won versus Saving Private Ryan, the sort of controversies over Steven Spielberg's like World War II like redux. Like he made Schindler's List, which is a very specific kind of war movie, and then he went and he made a completely different kind of World War II movie. And like, the likes of which had never been seen before. And in 1998, the movies up for Best Picture are Shakespeare in Love, Elizabeth, Roberto Benigni's, Life is Beautiful, the Thin Red Line, and Saving Private Ryan. They're war movies and they're period pieces. And they sort of like overlap in certain ways. Like Elizabeth is also a war movie. They sort of represent the sort of the way that the Oscars had sort of embraced in the late 90s, like a certain aesthetic of prestige, that it was this like, the gritty war drama or the elevated historical costume drama. And when the historical costume drama won, and it's excellent, Shakespeare in Love is excellent, I will die on this hill. It represented this like horrifying schism in cultural tastes, like the idea that something less meaningful, presumably, than World War II would win Best Picture. The World War II, so technically incredibly captured by Spielberg, that the sort of like intensity of the subject matter married with the unbelievable skill and it took to pull off the movie versus a sort of like widely glamorous, you know, Miramax production. I think emblematizes the clash of these concepts at that particular cultural moment. And now we have movies like The Brutalist, which certainly traffic in traditions of cinema grandiosity and like Oscar fodder of a bygone era, up against movies, like Anora or The Substance, which are fundamentally like indie. I mean, like, yes, like festival darlings, but still small potatoes when it comes to the traditional metrics that the Academy has trafficked in.
And do you think that's an outgrowth of the composition of the Academy these days? The fact that it's been changing in recent years, that these new movies have come through or broken through, or is it what studios are willing to put money behind and campaign behind? Like, what is it primarily?
Yeah, this is a great question. I don't know if it's predominantly the composition of the Academy because we don't have access to all of the names of all of the members of the Academy. However, the Academy has been making many, many recent efforts to include a more relevant spectrum of artists, which includes giving an Academy membership to winners, nominees, and other players in the industry who have made significant artistic achievements, who are from particularly underrepresented communities in the cinematic hegemony, but also firing Academy members who rest on their laurels and don't engage, don't produce, and certainly don't watch enough movies. I also think it's due to the rise of new markers of prestige. We have distributors like Criterion Collection and Kino Lorber, which have been, like slaving behind the scenes for 20 years, 30 years in some cases, but um, have only within the last maybe 10 years received a more mainstream tastemaker status. At the same time, we have production companies like A24 and Neon that are um, becoming like almost mainstream for their uh, extremely innovative horror and genre bending and meta and playful movies. Production companies like A24 and Neon, which have been around for their fair share of time as well, are now encountering the rise of niche groups on the internet, like Film Twitter. And suddenly you have whole groups of people who are able to bond over their knowledge of and interest in those distributors and other production companies and then institutions and build a larger fan culture out of that. And I think that's what's so significant about this current cultural moment that we actually have, in this sort of age of increasing isolation, and people are not going out and watching movies in theaters maybe the way that they were in the 30s. And streaming has hampered so much from livelihoods of actors and screenwriters to literally how you spend an evening as a consumer. That being said, it's also opened up opportunities for people to find one another sort of cross-continentally, globally, and bond over their appreciation of these aesthetic and narrative factories of note, in a way that gives those institutions great power.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if I'm going to say one positive thing about streaming, it's exciting to get your movie in front of that many people. I mean, it's really striking. I mean, we're talking, well, we don't have the data, but it's got to be, like tens and tens of millions of people for some of these things. If you look at something like Squid Game and the way that some of these international, like global series have opened people up to watching content or films with subtitles. That wasn't the case before streaming as much. So it's not all bad, but it is mostly bad. And I do mourn the loss of traditional, quote unquote, traditional um, prestige movies, movies that challenge you to concentrate more. But I also celebrate the blurring of the categories between what were used to be thought of as genre films and kind of were ghettoized for that. Now stepping into, as a genre film lover, now stepping into like the Academy Awards and getting the respect I think they always deserved. It's
Yeah.
very exciting.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Genre is present at the Oscars more than ever. I mean, we have a Best Picture slate that's got a Dune 2, got a science fiction sequel in it. We have, several indie movies. We have a horror movie. We have an international film, a non-English language film. Maybe two if you count Emilia Perez, which I don't know. I do, because there's a lot of English in
It's
that.
from France. That's
It's
not
from
American.
France. No, it's from France. A lot of the dialogue is in Spanish. It's a lot of the dialogue's in English. Selena Gomez is very confusing. That is sort of a musical. Wicked is a musical. We have all these different um, levels, these tiers of box office, uh, expected box office success are represented in these films. There's like no way that, Anora is released and it's expected to perform as well as Wicked. And yet, historically, neither one of those films would be in contention against one another during the Academy Awards. So I think it's an interesting year. I mean, it's also in a way like a kind of light year. I mean, we don't have a big, except for The Brutalist, which is in many ways this year's Oppenheimer. We don't have the sort of like Barbie versus Oppenheimer of last year, this sort of like representation of like traditional, like very masculinized, impressive technical filmmaking, and then like a movie that represents the increasing rise of female auteurs in cinematic conversations and in these hallways of prestige. And like, so we
It,
don't have that debate articulated as well this year, but
and it's interesting to even think about it like a debate and to put it in those terms. I
yeah.
think that that might even also be something that's new. I think I suffer from a bit of amnesia about what the world used to be like, but it's kind of interesting that we try to filter these movies through these ideas that I'm not sure were so present. I mean, I guess they were back to what you were saying about the late 90s. I think they were starting to exist there, but prior to that, and certainly not with the intensity that they exist now, um, we don't filter movies through these. We don't categorize them in the way that algorithms have conditioned us to categorize things so rigidly,
Right. Yeah.
or command or demand that they represent something outside of the movie itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Culturally, politically. I could be wrong, but to me that seems like a fairly new phenomenon,
Yeah.
and you certainly felt it this year.
I mean, it feels like a new phenomenon, even if it's not, right? Like there's,
Right.
there are ways that it has hit our level of entertainment practitioners, So, even if it pre-existed, it's affecting us now more than ever.
And perhaps that's the only way that people have to really engage. I mean, I think it's ugly a lot of the time, but at the same time, hey, if it gets people to engage with movies and watch
Yeah.
movies, maybe that's the price we have to pay in 2025.
Yeah. I mean, I think about institutions like Letterboxd, right, that are all about a sort of like Goodreadsification, like democratization of for film criticism. But in a way, it's like it's not like Goodreads. It's not sort of like inviting the like angry hordes of like vengeance-seeking Amazon book buyers. Maybe I have to not say this in a live recording so the Goodreads audience doesn't kill me. But Letterboxd represents like a democratization of film criticism while it also engages in this sort of like tradition of everyone's a critic that goes all the way back to the blog, right? Like you don't have to have a film degree, you don't have to have a syndicated column or, a PBS show. You and your opinions can, have some sort of platform, some sort of stage, a proscenium. And at the same time, Letterboxd I think has prevailed in being for film lovers as opposed to like an Amazon review section or something like that. Like the Letterboxd review also has sort of become an art unto itself. And like the fact that various celebrities have had them, like Margot Robbie, who's like, pseudonym of Maggie Ackerley was like uncovered, and Io Edebiri and Io Edebiri, who had to like leave Letterboxd after people were just like loving her reviews way too much and it got a little intense. Like, I think there's an interesting way that sort of like the shitposting Paul Schrader article you wrote for LitHub, like, I think there's an interesting way that conversations about film are starting to find new locations. And there are places that I think that for film, more than any other medium, feel kind of like you're at a bar talking to a random stranger than, like book Twitter, for instance. I think film Twitter or Letterbox feels very much like you turn to the guy next to you and you're like, how about that thing? Like you're sort of all watching the game, except the game is the Oscars. You know what I mean? Or the game is the
100%.
SAG
Yeah.
Awards. Yeah, no, we should have a movie bar, a movie sports bar, Alex.
Yeah.
Yeah, where it's
Oh,
just award shows.
maybe I'm scared. Yeah, I mean, I just like there's something about I look like this is just me maybe, but like I grew up hating sports. And to me, award shows and talking about movies like this and even giving them ratings, it turns the thing that I love into sports. And
Yes.
that makes me deeply uncomfortable for probably very personal reasons. But nevertheless, I feel uncomfortable with it. It is what it is. And I'm excited that people are talking about movies at all. However, I do feel uncomfortable also with this other line that I feel has blurred, and maybe you have an opinion about this, Olivia. The line between it's a good movie and I like this movie have
Yes.
complete that line has completely disappeared for people in a way, even people I consider smart and good critical thinkers, like they cannot separate these
Yeah.
concepts. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, as one of the most vocal supporters in the world of the movie Bullet Train, I feel uniquely equipped to answer this question. Um, Bullet Train is not a good movie, and yet I love it. I think there are parts of Bullet Train that are great, objectively great. Doesn't make the whole thing a good movie. Um, in fact, it actually makes it more of a tragic story because some of those parts are great and they get completely sunk by this sort of like ludicrous Deadpoolification of cinema. This sort of syndrome of a latter day. I mean, like, I don't want to say anything denigrating about a particular filmmaker or star. But anyway, there's just like there's schlock. There's always been schlock, hence the name of this podcast. And we celebrate that as well. But we do find it important to examine the sort of distinctions or lack of distinctions that appear around those artworks that are thought of or not thought of as schlock. And I think, yes, I completely agree with you that there's absolutely no difference between this is a good movie and I like this movie. And I I do think though that moments like that are really interesting for people like you and me who are fascinated by people's weird movie opinions and like love to hear cases made to consider things that we might not normally have considered. And your podcast, Substack Extravaganza Underexposed, is about taking movies that are underappreciated but also excellent and overlooked and sort of walking the different corral around the different corrals of those things. And you have examined films that are both excellent and like fun, um, or movies that are personally extremely enjoyable, and then movies that are really important or artistically significant and worth one's time. And I don't have anything articulate to say that's causal, except once again to underscore that this all contributes to the, or is contributed to by the sort of increasing insularization of the consumer and a sort of like Daily Me-esque content fountain of personalization and of access to a platform that allows the collapsing of the distinction between an opinion and a well-researched analysis. And I think watching that sort of ire of the non-reviewer, like get mad at a reviewer for not thinking a Marvel movie is great or something like that. I mean, I could easily turn this podcast into one all about the changing definitions of criticism because I'm so interested in what it means to be a critic in this day and age in which everyone's a critic in a completely different sense of the word. Um, but like the idea that, Pitchfork couldn't write a mediocre review of a Taylor Swift album and not have the reviewer be doxxed. Like Halsey said that the offices of Pitchfork should burn down, and then realized they were in the Freedom Tower and was like, oh, gotta apologize. Um, like it's ground zero, baby. So I think, we're in this world where people think of critics as like frustrated artists who don't succeed, who then take out their anger and their ire on other artists. And Taylor Swift, God love her, but is like a big perpetrator of this, right? The song Mean is about like, someday I'll be living in a big old city and all you're ever going to be is me. Like, and maybe that one critic she's singing about did suck as a person or as a reviewer or was an irresponsible practitioner of his craft. But like the idea that anyone's opinion is just as valid as someone who is a professional researcher, analyst, and is knowledgeable about the craft and knows how to illuminate what works and what doesn't work, and whose job is ultimately to bring these works of art into the mainstream. The idea that that person is the enemy because that person is not subscribed to a specific fandom. I mean, it was sort of implied that A.O. Scott left his job at the Times as the film critic and moved to the book section because he was tired of having like all these people come after him for not loving like whatever Captain America sequel is out there. And that's my answer to your question.
Well, it's really exciting that you're starting this wonderful podcast where you can reassert your authority, hopefully, or at least your knowledge, and hope that the fever breaks a little bit and hope that people learn to value not only prestigious movies, but wonderful genre
Right.
schlocky movies, and that
Yeah.
you can help illuminate the reasons why those things are great in a larger context for people.
In a way that encourages everyone to do the same because we also rather than have like a million in the angry horde of like opinion focused people, what we want is a generation of incisive analytical critics, and that we can all have share our opinions and have interesting conversations that advance questions and causes in art. Like critics don't want people to not want to engage. If there's an opinionated angry person, it's going to be hard to engage with them because they're not going to listen. But like their passion comes from the right place. Like they want to talk about art and why it's meaningful. There's just no understanding that art can be meaningful without also being other things. And the distinctions are really important. And so like I encourage as many people with thoughts as possible. Like I love when people reach out to me with their questions or ideas or opinions about movies because that's where the good stuff from discussion comes. Everyone has something to say. Just because not everyone's an official critic doesn't mean people's opinions aren't interesting and valid. It just means that there is a sort of soup that everyone sort of has to wade through that becomes increasingly antagonistic and suspicious of people who are seen as not liking their opinions. And what we reviewers would like to say is, no, we really like your opinions. We want more people to write think pieces on why this movie actually is really important to them. That's great. The more people we have championing art on any level, the better. And like, far be it from me, a fan of the movie Bullet Train, to say, don't watch your Marvel movie. Like, go, enjoy, it's fun. But like, let's all have conversations about what art isn't supposed to do instead of getting mad and alienating people who are protecting art as their job, mission, and hobby and calling and vocation.
Amen, Olivia. Well said.
Thank you, my friend. Would you like to now have the animal part of the Zoom where the credits roll and we have the pets wave?
Please, can we?
Yeah, let's go.
Culture Schlock is brought to you by LitHub Radio and produced by Buffalivia Media. The peppy Culture Schlock theme song you're listening to right now was written and performed by Richard Rutigliano. This episode was produced by Olivia Rutigliano and John Buffalo Mailer with support from Drew Broussard at LitHub. And of course, this episode would not have been possible without the participation of Alex Rollins Berg, whose fantastic multimedia publication Underexposed is available on Substack. I'm your host, Olivia Rutigliano. Thanks for listening. See you again next time.